So socialism meant, and you'll still find this if you look up the definition in like Merriam-Webster's dictionary or something like that, but socialism and all the socialists of the late 1800s, the 1900s, and like all of these socialists, what they meant by socialism was a very clear-cut definition. Much like when people talk about libertarianism a lot, one of my big complaints is that they always pick on something that's not what we define libertarianism as, private property and the non-aggression principle. But socialism meant state ownership of the means of production. Now, just to be clear about that, what that means more or less is state ownership of everything. You could say the means of production isn't technically everything. I mean, maybe you could have your own personal private property or personal property, whatever they would call it. But, it's like, okay, Rob, you can have that bottle of water, but the state's going to own the machine that makes that bottle of water. The state's going to own all the machinery, all the factories, every fucking industry. We're not talking about, it's not just like what the military isn't socialist enough for the true socialists, because there shouldn't even be Lockheed Martin and companies like that. These are private companies that work with the government in this like fascistic, corporatist world. So they're saying government runs everything. Now, where that has been tried, and that has been tried many times, and it has been, the biggest disaster of any ideology that's ever been implemented in human history. And there's like examples and examples, and whatever, like Vietnam and the Soviet Union and Mao Zedong's China and Cuba and Venezuela. Maybe Venezuela isn't complete socialism in that sense, but it's pretty damn near close. Every time it leads to the exact same thing. North Korea could be another example of that. Where the government, maybe if it doesn't ever own all of the means of production, is pretty goddamn close and pretty much controls everything that it doesn't own, which you could say, in my world is pretty much ownership. I mean, if you have exclusive control over something, you pretty much own it. If someone can't make decisions with their own property, then you pretty much are really the final, if you have the final say, you're kind of the owner. And yeah, that's been an absolute disaster everywhere it's tried. And it's worth, like I know people who advocate socialism now, they run away from all of that stuff. And they'll say things like, well, maybe, the Soviet Union and China were socialist, but they were also authoritarian. So we don't like the authoritarianism. We just like the socialism. It's like, fine, but would you at least acknowledge, if you're advocating something, that other people who advocated that led to a society that led to, genocide and starvation? Wouldn't you think you would want to go, well, is there a connection between these two? Is there something intrinsic in the system that could maybe lead toward genocide and starvation? And if you even start thinking in that direction, the question answers itself. Well, I want one organization who's in charge of everything. Okay. Well, isn't that just a little bit ripe to be, corrupted? And if that is corrupted, holy shit. Now you got Stalin in charge of everything. You've got Mao Zedong in charge of everything. And they end up being, the worst butchers in human history. So, okay. That's the traditional definition. Now, if you want to say what he said here is that socialism is people pooling money together to help people out who need it. Actually, let's take it back to the beginning. I want to get it word for word correct, what the definition of socialism that he's going with. Because let's take on this definition.
You often hear people asking,
has socialism worked anywhere it's been tried?
Name one country that socialism has ever worked.
The answer is everywhere.
Wait, what?
Socialism is pooling our resources together and using them for the common good. And it's been successfully implemented.
So socialism is pooling our resources together and using them for the common good. Well, that seems to be a good definition of charity, maybe even insurance. But that's a really weak definition of socialism. I mean, you want to make this really broad thing that like nobody that I know is against pooling resources and using them for the common good. Pooling kind of implies that it's voluntary, but okay. So where has it been a success? Everywhere. That's what he says, everywhere. So I don't know what world you're living on, but nothing has really been a success everywhere. I certainly wouldn't say capitalism has been a success everywhere. I don't know what you could like. Are you ignoring like, you know, Africa and large parts of South America and large parts of Asia where like societies are not functioning at all? It's actually working very, very poorly. So, and of course, socialism, at least in the traditional definition, it certainly hasn't been a success there. So, okay, but let's play the end of the video.
All around the world. That could mean things like publicly funded healthcare. So if you live in Britain and you like the NHS, then guess what? You're a socialist.
Oh, me?
Don't believe me? Look at how they describe publicly funded healthcare in America.
The socialist idea of universal healthcare.
Britain's socialized medical system, healthcare, all government provided, God forbid, like England.
Do you like publicly funded teachers, police, firefighters, schools, roads, and libraries? Think wealthy corporations like Google and Amazon should actually pay some tax to pay for these things?
Well, then. So, there is at least a fair point to be said that the way the term is used today does mean more of what this guy's talking about. But what you're talking about when you say socialism, I think is more correctly defined as statism. That's why we use that term, because what you're talking about is actually the existence of a state and anything a state does. If a state does anything, you're considering that socialism.
Also, the examples that you're pointing to are thanks to the success of the private market, they're able to fund socialism in individual sectors.
Well, look, this is what
turn the whole economy into, see how that plays out.
Sure.
Which is why even China's got a somewhat of a private market.
Of course. And in fact, they didn't start getting pulled out of poverty until they started liberalizing, privatizing large swaths of their economy. But look, if you're going to say, like, the reality is that most countries, most advanced countries today are mixed economies. Now, I don't think that means that a mixed economy is the right way to go, but that has been the evolution of most of these countries. Socialists, what's really infuriating about using the term socialism is that it used to mean this thing that was state ownership of the means of production. That's been completely bailed on as a completely failed idea. Like, nobody's even advocating that. Virtually no one is advocating that. And yet they continue to use the word without ever saying like, oh yeah, that was a big disaster, advocating for that. So really what I call it statism. You can call it a mixed economy, or you can call it interventionism, where the government intervenes in different areas or even like takes over different areas of the economy. But to just say you're a socialist, let's say you like universal healthcare. Like, let's say, as the example he used, you live in England and you like their universal healthcare. Well, then you're a socialist. It's like, well, okay. But by that same logic, if let's say you live in England and you like shop at a business, like I like that privately owned business. Are you a capitalist now? So, okay, if you're going to say, if I like anything about the government, I'm a socialist, well, then I could also say, by the exact same logic, if you like anything about the market, you're a capitalist, right? So that doesn't really prove anything one way or the other. If people like some things about the government, that doesn't make you a socialist. That doesn't mean you love the government wholeheartedly. And it's like, okay, if you like the government, you can just cherry pick a few things that you like about it. But let's just say, like, to use an analogy, let's say the government was a person. Let's say there was a person, who had like a really sweet, house. And like big screen TVs and a jacuzzi and a big pool and had parties and stuff. And be
porch?
Like, you
nice
like
porch?
Big porch, okay? Sandwich spread, all right, Rob? Let me make this something you can relate to. But right, so they go, do you like hanging out at this person's house? And you'd be like, yeah, I like that. And they'd be like, then you're a fan of this person. You're a fan of this person because you like hanging out at his house. Well, you might be like, yeah, but he also murders children. And you were like, yeah, but you're saying you want to, throw this person in jail or something like that because he's murdering kids. And they're like, but you liked hanging out at his house, so you like this person. Well, it's a little more complicated than that, right? You don't judge a person just by one aspect. Rob, you still get the sandwiches no matter what happens.
I got really confused.
Okay?
I was like,
don't worry. You still get them.
Cool.
But it's just saying, it's like, well, okay, so you might like that aspect, but then you could also say like, well, how do you like, like wars and being robbed and, people being thrown in cages and a monopoly on the criminal justice system. I mean, like we could name a whole bunch of another, hey, how'd you like the fucking, that recession in 2008? You're like, okay, so you could just say, just because you like a few things that the state does doesn't mean that you embrace it as a whole. There's also lots of things I could list that me and you would list all the time that would make you not like it. So as much as liking the healthcare would make you a statist, liking the market, by that logic, would make you a capitalist. So truthfully speaking, I can make my argument for why I think statism is wrong, and I make it, pretty much every episode of this show. But even if you just want to look in reality, in the real world, if you recognize that these are mixed economies, right? Because that's the reality of it. What he's talking about, it's worked everywhere. Well, these are companies that have a market and then have some government sectors. And as you pointed out before, the government sectors are funded by the market. I mean, that's where they get their money from, is from these taxes that they take from people who are working, in the market. And don't give me this shit. Government workers don't pay taxes. They don't pay taxes. This is all fucking bullshit. Like, I mean, theoretically they do, but if you're being paid with tax dollars and then being taxed on those dollars, you're basically just being paid whatever your take-home pay is, right? So if I whatever, if I rob money out of your wallet to pay for Brian, or I rob money from your wallet to put in this pool, and then I pay Brian money and go, and I'm also going to rob a little bit from you to put in this pool. Brian didn't get robbed. Like, I'm sorry. You didn't get robbed. You're just left with money that came out of you in this pool. The taxpayers put the pool in, and the people that are leeching off the system get whatever they get out. That is not really paying taxes. So they're funded by the private sector. But okay, so we have mixed economies. And truthfully speaking, if you really want to break it down, every economy that's ever had a state is to some degree a mixed economy. Even the Soviet Union, I mean, there were private farms in the Soviet Union, a very small percentage, but there were a few private ones, and there was a black market. So that was kind of outside of the government's purview, but that government just intervened way, 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 way more. And compared to something like Sweden that intervenes less, and then compared to, like, I don't know, Singapore or Hong Kong or something like that intervenes less than them. So, okay, why don't we look at what countries are like functioning better and what countries are really fucking falling apart? And the truth is, if you look at the more, if you want to call to some degree the ones with less government interventions more capitalist and the ones with more government interventions more socialist, all right, well, the ones with more government intervention, you're going to be looking at countries like on the far end, North Korea and Venezuela. If you would look at Cuba, in the past, the Soviet Union and countries like that, they're absolute disasters. And then if you look at the countries with way less government intervention, they have their problems mostly because of the government sector, but they're functioning okay. So it's not very clear that people just like socialism because they like one thing the government does.